Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me for the second webinar this week. Now, unlike yesterday, I've remembered to turn on my microphone. I remember to turn on my microphone right now, so hopefully you'll be able to hear me. But if you could just let me know if you can hear me, if you can't hear me, if you've got any other technical problems whatsoever that might be on my side, then please let me know, and I'll be more than happy to fix those as best that I can. As always, as I'm going through the webinar, I'll be looking left and right because I'll be looking at two screens at the same time, as it were, just to see what's going on, make sure that the live stream is in good health and that there aren't any problems with connection. Whoops, let's just get rid of that, for example. So I asked you to have a look at three sentences today, and let's have a look at the first one. An interested party may make an application for a modification or revocation of an anti-dumping order or termination of a suspension agreement during an annual administrative review. A revocation application will normally receive no consideration by the board unless there has been no sales at less than fair value for a period of at least 3 consecutive years. What we've got here is two pretty monstrous sentences. And why are they monstrous? Well, the main problem behind this sentence, or these sentences, are the overuse of nominalizations. And there are nominalizations absolutely everywhere. Now, a nominalization, I've done two videos on nominalization, so I've got about almost 40 minutes of footage of me in my explanatory videos explaining the problems behind nominalizations, what nominalizations are, how they're constructed, and so on, so on. So I'm going to give you the brief overview of what a nominalization is. A nominalization is where you have a noun, and that noun is acting as a verb. And the clearest example of this is to give you a simple example. For example, John made a call to Bob, let's say. So we've got made, which is our verb in that sentence. But the problem with it is that it has absolutely nothing to do, that verb has absolutely nothing to do with the action which is involved in that sentence. The actual action is hidden in the noun, which in this case is a call. So instead of saying Jim made a call to Bob, we could just say Jim called Bob. So the noun in the original sentence is acting as a verb. Now that was a very, very simple sentence, and it doesn't really show the depth of the problem of nominalizations. This sentence, or these sentences, however, do. Nominalizations, if you have too many nominalizations in a sentence, if you have too many nouns which are built from verbs, in effect, in a sentence, it makes the sentence a nightmare. And you get the feeling it's a nightmare straight away just by reading it. If you read it, it almost sounds like some kind of twisted poem. An interested party may make an application for a modification or revocation of an anti-dumping order or termination of a suspension agreement during an annual administrative review. It sounds crazy. How are you meant to deal with all those shons? You've got application, modification, revocation, termination, suspension, administrative. To give you an idea of what how the size of the problem in this sentence, I've highlighted the noun nominalizations here. So you've got make an application for a modification or revocation. You've got termination, suspension agreement, revocation application, and receive no consideration. All of these are nominalization structures, and all of these nouns are hiding strong verbs which we should be using instead. Now, the reason why this is so important is because in English you have three elements of a sentence: subjects, verbs, and objects. And the most important part in that sentence is the verb, because the verb tells you what's going on. And if we know what the verb is, we've then got a good idea of working out what the subject is, in other words, the person or thing that's doing the verb, and what's being affected, which is the object. So the verb is the most important thing. So when we're writing sentences, we should be using strong verbs to communicate the action or what's happening. And if we use weak verbs, which is what we do when we use nominalizations, then that message becomes more abstract, more harder to understand, and there's a much higher possibility of the person who's receiving the letter, the person who's reading the letter or the email or the memo or whatever it might be, would misunderstand what it is that you're trying to say. And in the example videos that I do on nominalizations, I really go into detail and break this down and give you examples of how something can be misunderstood. And maybe we'll be able to see that in this example here. So if we have a look at this in a bit more detail to work out what the basic main message is, and remember that's what I was saying yesterday, is that the most important thing for you to correct your writing, particularly when you're redrafting your writing, is to ask yourself the simple message, what am I really trying to say? And if you ask yourself that message, you're going to get down to the basic message that should be communicated. So let's have a look at this. The first sentence. An interested party, so there we have our subject. An interested party may make an application for a modification or revocation of an anti-dumping order. Let's try and deal with this bit. What is the main verb here? What's the key action here? Which one of these nominalizations is hiding our verb? Is it application, which should be apply? Is it modification, which might be modify? Or is it revocation, which could be revoke? Which one of those is hiding the main verb? I would argue that it's that the main verb here should be apply. So we could say an interesting party may apply. And then what happens after you use apply? After you use apply, you have to use a full infinitive. You apply to do something. You apply to make something. You can also apply for something as well. Yes, you can apply for a job, but you can also apply to plus action. And remember, if we go down that road of to plus action and using the full infinitive, we're using more verbs than if we use for, in which case we're forced to use nouns. And remember, verbs are stronger words of communication than nouns. So we could redraft this to say, an interesting party may apply to modify or revoke an anti-dumping order. And suddenly we get a much stronger sentence, of course, and that much stronger sentence not only communicates the message a lot better, but also uses less words. I'm going to put the my solution up in a second, so you'll see. In fact, I'll pop it up now, and then I'll talk through it. So here at the bottom, you can see, just squeezed in, an interesting party may apply to modify or revoke an anti-dumping order. And here we can use exactly the same idea in the brackets as well, or to terminate a suspension agreement during an annual administrative review. And that sentence is much stronger, much better at communicating the main message, if we understand the main message correctly. Because the other thing about using a sentence with nominalizations is that when you give that to someone to read, the process that they go through is that they naturally, when you're dealing with English, you try to identify the verbs. And so what you're basically asking the reader to do is for the reader to find the main verb and then understand the sentence based on the main verb that the reader has chosen, which of course then leads us down the road of misunderstanding or misinterpreting what you're trying to say, which of course is not the aim of communication. Excuse me. The aim of communication is for you to communicate your message in a way that is understood in the way you wanted it to be understood. No one wants to write a message in which you write something and then it could be misunderstood or might be understood, or there's a good chance it will be misunderstood. Presumably you write a message to make sure that someone understands what you're trying to say. If we have a look at the second sentence, a revocation application will normally receive no consideration by the board unless there have been no sales at less than fair value for a period of at least 3 consecutive years. Now, this sentence not only uses nominalizations, but it also introduces a passive-like, a quasi-passive structure. And this is what I used to call an artificial passive. And what I mean by this is that you have a series of actions, which in this case are hidden by nouns using nominalizations. And then at some point in the sentence, you have to say, who does these things? And then you just throw in at some point by someone. And you think, okay, good, so I've communicated the action, now I've said who's done it, and so job done, tick, tick. The problem with this is that it's not great English, and second of all, it's open to interpretation, and third of all, it's terrible to read. A revocation application will normally receive no consideration by the board unless da 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 da. There's a much easier way to say that, of course, going back to the active voice. So the subject is clearly the board. And and now we need a verb. And if we dig amongst the original sentence, we can see that the verb structure will not normally consider. So we've created a verb from one of the nominalizations. Consideration becomes consider. And then we have to say the board will not normally consider what? Well, in this case, what we've done here is we've created a gerund from the nominalization revocation. Now, in my when I was working in the law firm and with various other different people, I created a hierarchy of preferred language, and that hierarchy of preferred language always had verbs at the top, and it had nouns at the bottom. And so you had verbs at the top, then you had, I think more or less on the same level, you had gerunds and you had passive structures. And then right at the bottom, you have nouns. So when I'm proofreading a text and I see a structure that full of nominalizations that needs to be changed, I always go through that process. If I can create an active version of that sentence, fantastic. If I can't create an active version, I look to see if I can create a gerund. Normally, that's my first step. If I can't create a gerund, then I have a look. Okay, I need a verb of some kind. So finally, even though I'm not a huge fan of the passive, we go to the passive and see, can we use the passive correctly in this sense? And if those 3 things cannot be met, then we fall upon using the noun because we have to use the noun. But here, we don't need the passive structure. We don't need any nominalizations. We do, however, need the gerund. So the board will not normally consider revoking an order unless there have been no sales, and then the sentence continues. And in our redrafted sentence, we have a much, much stronger sentence using strong verbs and language of action. Because although revoking is a gerund, it is a noun, the ing element does suggest an element of action. Remember, ing words can also be present participles, which as you would know, because you're excellently versed in grammar, this is part of the continuous voice. And we use the continuous tense, and we use the continuous tense to suggest actions, things that are happening. And so that also gives the reader an image, an idea that something's happening, something's going on. So these would the 2 sentences that you can see at the bottom would be my way that I would correct the original sentence if I was given the original sentence during a proofreading task, or I was asked to have a look at the language and appraise it. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you agree or disagree with me. Either write a comment in the live chat if you're feeling brave enough, or write a comment below, or send me an email. I'm more than happy to get into the discussion. And of course, if you think that I'm wrong or that I've misunderstood the text, then please let me know. I'm quite happy to get into that discussion with you. Okay, so let's have a look at our second sentence. Target represents a specific form of consolidation that originated from the central banks rather than the markets in order to facilitate the implementation of the single monetary policy of the Eurosystem. Seems okay, doesn't it? Not too bad. If we have a look at the sentence structure, it's not too complicated. It is pushing on towards 25 words. If yesterday I was talking about average sentence length and what's the best number of words in terms of average sentence length, and it's basically anything under 25. This looks as though it might just creep in under that. So what's the problem with this? Well, the problem that I've got is with the second part of the sentence. In order to facilitate the implementation of the single monetary policy of the Eurosystem. We've got two of those. We've also got the nominalization in implementation as well. Do we need those of those? Are those of those strictly necessary? Well, in the explanation video that I do on of the, I go through 3 different ways that you can eliminate of those, because one problem in legal writing and business writing is that of the is overused, of the, and particularly if you use lots of nouns or nominalizations, then you start throwing in of the and other prepositional phrases all over the place. And very often you might meet a sentence that says of the, in the, on the, of the, and so on, so on, so on. And those sentences are always quite difficult to understand. So the question is not to eliminate of the, but to try and reduce the usage of the if it's possible to do that. So how can we eliminate the of the's here? Because I think that we can get rid of both of them. Well, the first thing to do would be to have a look at possessive apostrophes. In other words, the Eurosystem is our subject in this sentence. So what belongs to the Eurosystem? Well, we could say that the single monetary policy belongs to the Eurosystem because it says the single monetary policy of the Eurosystem. So we could say the Eurosystem's single monetary policy. Straight away, we get rid of one of the. Now, in the explanatory video that I do, I talk about noun strings. And noun strings are where you have lots and lots of nouns, one after the other, but you read them all together in order and in one go. And if you have a long noun string, then this can also be a bit of a nightmare to deal with. But single monetary policy, what we've got there is an adjective noun, is well known. It's a well-known collocation. Everyone knows what that is. It's not complicated. It's very, very common. So to use a 3-word phrase like that is okay. So we can say Eurosystem's single monetary policy, there's no problems. But if it was a little bit longer, then we might think maybe keeping the of the would be a better solution. But in this case, Eurosystem single monetary policy. I'll show you my reworked answer. And in order to get rid of implementation, just like as in the previous sentence, what we have to do is go through that hierarchy I suggested and go from start from active verbs to gerunds to passives to nouns. And what we can do here is we can just use the full infinitive. We can say in order to facilitate and implement the Eurosystem single monetary policy. Now, straight away, you might be raising a few red flags here, and you might say, what you've done, Simon, is you've materially changed the meaning of this sentence. And yes, I'm aware that this might have happened. So, for example, I'm not facilitating and implementing, which is what I've done, which is the correction that I've made. But what you're actually trying to do is facilitate how something is implemented. and my change here actually does create a difference between how I've changed the sentence and the original sentence. So if this is not correct, then you could just say, in order to facilitate how the Eurosystem's single monetary policy is implemented. So we can get around it that way if we have to. But largely, when I'm dealing with this problem when I'm proofreading, I contact because when I'm making the changes, I'm always very aware when I might be making a material change to the document. I always get in contact with the author and I say, listen, what is it that you're trying to say here? And more often than not, this change is okay, but it might be a material change to the document. So whenever you're making these changes, whether it's nominalizations or of the, you've always got to be aware that if you're making material changes to the documents. Now, of course, if you're writing the document yourself, then you're aware of what you're writing and you're aware of what material change, if you're making a material change. But if you're checking someone else's document, then this is, or indeed if you're trying to interpret a text, which is full of prepositional phrases, then this is the danger that you might have. In interpreting the text, because you have to interpret it, you might interpret it incorrectly and come up with a different meaning. But that problem is not your problem, unfortunately. At least it's not your problem in one sense. The problem has been created because the sentence has been badly drafted. Unfortunately, we have to deal with badly drafted sentences a number of times, or pretty much every time you pick up a legal work of some kind. So the problem with this sentence was the usages of the and whether they were strictly necessary. Okay, let's have a look at our third sentence. Each month, price lists were exchanged between the defendant manufacturers, and it was agreed by them that all sales would be made at list price or above. What's the problem here? As you can see, what we've got here is the use of the passive voice. Each month, price lists were exchanged between the defendant manufacturers, and it was agreed by them that all sales would be made at list price or above. Now, when you're dealing with the passive, as I was saying yesterday, and my explanation video on the passive goes into a lot of detail into this, you ask yourself three questions. You say, do we know who the subject is? Because if we don't know who the subject is, then we have to use the passive voice. Is the action of the subject more important than the subject itself? If the action is more important, then we have to use the passive voice, because normally and naturally the action is the focus of the sentence, not the person who does it. An example would be if there was a car crash, for example, someone would say there's been an accident, because the action is more important. You wouldn't say Jim crashed into Bob on the road. That the impact of the message would be lost straight away. So when you focus on the action, and there's a legitimate reason to focus on the action, then you can use the passive. And the third reason to use the passive is to create distance between the person who did an action and the action that was done. And very commonly, this is used when things go wrong. So if a mistake has been made, passive voice, then you would say, you wouldn't say, unless you were feeling brave, you wouldn't say, I did this wrong. You would say, it was done incorrectly. So you distance yourself from the problem. So those are our three main reasons for using the passive. There are other reasons why you can use the passive, but those three main ones are the ones that you should really concentrate on. And those are the three rules that we're going to apply to this, this writing here. So do we know, first of all, let's start off with the subjects. Do we know who the subjects are? Yes, we do. They are the defendant manufacturers. What are the defendant manufacturers doing? The defendant manufacturers were exchanging price lists, and they were agreeing that the sales would be made at list price or above. Now, the question you've got to ask yourself here is, well, first of all, do we need to create distance between the defendant manufacturers and their actions? No, we don't. In fact, we need to connect the actions to the people who are doing those actions, so we don't need to create distance. So the question then becomes, are the actions more important than the people doing them? And there could be a context in which the actions are more important. Of course, we don't have the whole context, we just have this one sentence. So there could be a context. So this sentence could be correct. This sentence could be using the passive correctly. On the other hand, there might not be a context, and this passive might be used simply out of habit or because someone believes mistakenly that the passive voice is some level of formal English, or that legal writing or business writing must be written in the passive voice, which of course is nonsense. The passive voice is a grammar structure, and like all grammar structures, it follows rules why we have to use the passive. We can't just use the passive, we can't elevate the passive to a level of formality that it simply doesn't have. The formal and the active voice are on exactly the same level in terms of register, in terms of formality. They're both exactly the same. They can be formal and they can be informal. The passive voice by itself is not more formal than the active voice. So getting back to that, if we wanted to change this, how could we change it? Well, we could change it in pretty much the same way that I explained. Each month, the defendant manufacturers exchanged price lists, and they agreed to make all sales at list price or above. And this sentence tells us a lot more straight away. First of all, it identifies who's doing what. Each month, the defendant manufacturers, and then it tells us the actions. Exchange price lists, and they agree to do something. And that method of communication, active voice, subject, verb, object, is much more powerful than the passive voice. And it is a much more normal and understandable method of communication than using the passive voice. When we're speaking normally and naturally, we communicate in the active voice. When we're speaking, we tend to use the passive voice correctly. It's some kind of mental process that we go through when we're speaking, that we're able to sort out the information much more logically and much more ably than when we're writing. It's almost as if when we're writing, we give ourselves the time to come up with structures that we wouldn't normally use when we're speaking, which is why when I ask lawyers that I work with, what's the basic main message, they always give me their answer in the active voice. And I always say to them, why didn't you just write what you told me? Because I understand what you wrote, but I don't understand what you've written. So this is the wonderful advantage of the active voice. And it goes back to the heart of the main idea behind writing, which is that you're trying to communicate something and you're hoping that someone will understand what it is that you are writing. Because if you're writing in a way that no one will understand, well, then you're not achieving your goal of communicating clearly. Okay, as I said, I made reference to a number of the explanatory videos that I've done, which you can find on YouTube. I'll put them in the link. I'll put those links in a comment below once this video is finalized and online, so you can have a look at those. Or you can simply go to my YouTube channel and check out those videos and go through them. As always, if you have any questions at all, any questions, queries, concerns, if you disagree with me, please get in contact. I'm more than happy to have that conversation with you. And I'll look forward to seeing you again next week at some point. Thank you very much. Enjoy your Fridays and goodbye.